Felicia Froton and Jeremy Tennell. Streaming to you recorded from Seattle, Washington. Here we go.
And where'd you get all these at?
I got those ones in the corner.
Oh, these are in the corner.
Yeah.
What part do you want to take on here, Lauren?
Huh?
What do you want to take on this piece, and I'll get writing checks?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, wow. It's a lot of cedar.
And this year we've had Western Hemlock, Pacific Silver Fir, Noble Fir, Douglas Fir, and Western Red Cedar.
I don't know what's happening out there, but I know that the trees are the lungs of the earth, and collecting and redistributing the seeds is for a good cause.
What you got in here?
Oh my God.
You got Western Hemlock in here?
Sorry, man. This guy's a stickler.
I normally flag as work, so I was just doing it on my off time.
Struggle of the 90s for a lot of these timber communities. Companies stopped operating in the early 90s. Poverty's risen by 50%. Schools have been cut by a third. So how do you really turn this around? How do you start to invest in community members, give them agency, give them opportunity? This is a piece of that. We've gotten about 650 bushels of seeds this year, and about 300 some of that is Western Red Cedar. Yeah, it's a lot. It's about $34,000, $32,000 in checks out to the community, which is amazing to get that money out there.
Yeah.
For hard work.
It is hard work.
It is.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Plowline Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Tennell, and today we've got a really exciting conversation to take place with a group of people who spend a lot of time in the woods. And whether you do or not, I think you're going to find this conversation enlightening. It is revolving around a documentary short by Trever Santora, and the name of it is Cone People. And I think if you haven't, you'll have a chance to be able to see it at a couple of different opportunities as well as online. The Cone People follows the journey of seed collectors and the vital role they play in the reforestation of forests all across Western United States. We're going to dive into the challenges of seed scarcity and the impact of climate change and wildfires, not only on our forests, but also on the communities that are surrounded by them. And we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of the communities that put these collection efforts together. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our guest today. I've got Trever Santora, who is the documentary filmmaker for Cone People and a product designer who provides unique insight into the lives of forestry workers. His work has been featured in NPR, CNN, Forbes, TechCrunch, and right here on the Plowline Podcast. And I also want to introduce Felicia Froton, specializes in organizing seed supply solutions. During her tenure at Mast Reforestation, she has organized the collection of thousands of pounds, tens of thousands of pounds actually, of seeds critical for reforestation needs across conifer forests in the Western United States. And finally, let me introduce you to Oak Rankin. He is the founder of the Glacier Peak Institute, creating a resilient future through connecting and understanding communities and youth with ecosystems. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to have you here today. Thanks for joining me on this conversation about Cone People and the changing landscape of our forests.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
So, Trever, do you mind giving me an idea of the inspiration for putting this documentary short together?
Well, yeah. When we talked earlier, Jeremy, I mentioned I'm sort of on a mission to make sure that pine cone is the first cone that comes to mind for many Americans. Sorry, traffic cones and cones of shame. And the inspiration for this actually really came from Silvaseed, which is the nursery that's featured in this story. Silvaseed has a storied history. It was founded in 1871, which is incredible. And so 153 years, I think, if my math's right. And the previous founders or owners, I should say, one of them is Mike Gerdes, and Mike was describing to me one day what a bushler does. And a bushler is essentially um, a a piece of carpentry that you pour your cones into to measure out a bushel, which is what the collectors bring in to the cone buying stations. And he started telling me the story of where these bushelers go and who they're for. And he described this incredible cast of people that I'd never heard of before. And I was actually kind of surprised because I'd spent a lot of time in the woods at one point as a commercial mushroom forager. And this was the first time I'd heard of people collecting cones. And so that was the start of this sort of seed, if you will, that got planted in my mind about cone people.
Yeah. Yeah, your documentary was actually the first time I'd ever heard about people collecting cone seeds in our forests. And so, Felicia, do you mind talking a little bit about how you got started in that and why you think, well, how did you find it?
Yeah, well, I mean, no pun intended, very much trial by fire. So I have been working for Mast, formerly Drone Seed, for a couple of years, and my mentor and colleague, Matthew Agai, at the time, kept on getting in my ear about, hey, there's a significant seed supply issue. We were at the time a small startup looking to scale reforestation, but we kept on bumping into these projects where, oh, let's go, replant this area, but lo and behold, there's no seed. There's no seed for these areas. There's no, and then the more I looked into it, seeing how little seed there was on the landscape. So in 2021, Mast acquired Silvaseed through good relationship with the Gerdes brothers. And before I knew it, I was in a truck with Mike Gerdes and my colleague Matthew, driving across Western Washington, Western Oregon, scouting for cones. So this is quite literally leaning over a steering wheel on forest roads with binoculars looking for cone crop. And in that time, in that really, quick summer, I was told about, okay, here's our cone buying stations, these legacy cone buyers that we worked with, areas that are important to serve both for reforestation as well as general commercial demand. I'll go into that a little bit later. And then, here's how you put those pieces together to make a collection happen. And at the same time I did that, I also was called on to organize cone collection in the other form that is beyond stations, but still works in rural communities and is critical to scaling. And that is with contractors who climb trees to collect cones. So I was introduced to this in rapid fire. But every season has brought new lessons and new rewards. The Cone People documentary is based on our 2022 collection season, so it features the smoke of the Bolt Creek fire. So every year, ironically, seed collection in the Western U.S. From California all the way to the Canadian border pretty much overlaps directly with fire season. So there's this really poignant sense of doing this work at that time that we have it. So yeah, it's a little bit of my background.
Yeah, that's great. Oak, I live in the I-5, I-405 corridor, Metro Seattle area. But you live in these communities. In fact, you're fourth generation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Fifth generation, if you
Fifth
include
generation.
kids. Somewhere around six, if you include Washington State in general.
Why are people, what's the need? Why are we collecting cone seeds? What's changed?
The need, it's been going for generations within Darrington. My father remembers collecting cones as a kid. I've been collecting cones with my kids. A number of people have been doing it for generations here in the community. And how GPI stepped in was that the cone buyer was stepping out and retiring, and there was no cone buyer. And so a local forester reached out to us and asked us if we would do this because of this need for cones. And there's a need of economic development within our community. A lot of the restoration economy just skips over these rural forest communities, and cone picking is one of those ways that our community can make money and bring money back into it. And so we stepped up as a need. We also realized that our rural forest communities, those kids are no longer getting outdoors. A lot of outdoor programs brings kids, which are great programs, from the I-5 corridor up and then back down. And our rural forest communities are some of the highest risk, most distressed in the region. And so we saw as an opportunity that we're doing to save the lives of the youth and create a better future, as well as for them to learn economically, an opportunity to partner with Silvaseed and Mast and provide that opportunity, and to teach kids how to go out and collect cones. We've taught them at the schools. We've ran our after school programs and had kids out just picking cones and participating as a way to make money and earn appreciation for the outdoors, as well as earning some economic benefit on the side.
Yeah, what a great way to get the youth back out into the woods. So, if you grew up in the if you grew up in the West Coast, in the past 40 or 50 years, the dramatic difference and the shift that it took place through the 70s and the 80s with rural communities within the western slopes of the Sierra and the Cascades. Forestry was on the decline, and these communities took a hard hit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk forever about that. So I'll work on being it short. And it was more in the 90s, 70s, 80s, logging was really booming. In fact, Darrington's median household income in rural forest communities and how much teachers was paid was higher than Seattle, due to a lot of timber sales and things happening. In the 90s, as available timber as well as the Northwest Forest Plan came into effect, we saw those job opportunities leave. And so the school's been cut by a third since the 90s. Poverty's increased by 50%. Special education rates have tripled. Forest Service has been cut by 90% within our community or so. There's just been a lot of struggle, and investment really hasn't came back in from the I-5 corridor, despite all this wealth growing. It hasn't came back in. And so it's been a real struggle. There's programs such as Secure Rural Schools, which are intended to invest in our rural communities and our schools and help them out. Instead, gets redivided based on enrollment to the whole county, which we're in a county of 800,000 people. So despite having this highest poverty, we would get $900 for the entire school because it was considered unfair to directly invest in this timber community. It had to be invested on enrollment. And so there was a lot of struggle, and there was, as those jobs are declining, in the 90s, there's other problems starting to increase with opioids and others within the region and without investment. And so we, as a community, were really struggling and looking towards that future of how can we find a path forward? What took was the OSO slide in 2014, killing 43 members of our community, to found Glacier Peak Institute and try to find a path forward through the outdoors and community. And since then, we've really grown, but we are unique. The struggle is not unique, but we are unique in what we're doing and finding a path forward and trying to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and a little context, it's not that the viable forestry and forests aren't in the Pacific Northwest any longer. It's that the globalization of those jobs have moved that forestry out of the United States completely. Is that a correct assessment?
I don't know as much about that. I know that it's moved, and maybe Felicia can comment more on that. I know that it's moved it out of our rural community. And so a lot more of the forestry that does happens on the I-5 corridor and where it's managed from. And that includes the forestry, but also includes the restoration economy. It includes the outdoor recreation economy, all of which are opportunities in the scientific collection economy, has moved much more away from these rural forest communities to elsewhere. And so there's a real struggle where I don't know if it's much globalization as much as it is nationalization or moving away from the rural places themselves.
Yeah. And, I'll speak a little bit to some of the movement of those industries. I definitely have seen, further divestment of rural communities point blank. That has been very obvious. Where those opportunities went, I actually think globalization was a little bit a part of it, but at the same time, a parallel story to the divestment in these rural communities was when the Northwest Forest Plan was enacted, there was a divestment from reforestation regeneration activities. That includes seed collection. There was a significant shift to, we'll just rely on orchards for our seeds, which is good. Orchards have their place. But, there wasn't this focus on preparing for what our changing climate needed us to be prepared for. And, in the early 90s, there was the Kyoto Protocol. We were aware of climate change. I mean, the oil companies have been aware of climate change since the 70s, but administration-wise and investment in the government agencies that were responsible for these forests, that was greatly divested from. And so without having our, government, U.S. Forest Service, et cetera, having the investment to not only instill a workforce to address this, a fairly paid workforce that can base out of the forest that they work in, we have seen a significant decline in, the scale of seed supply based on the need with, not only to address general industry, so whether that's, commercial nurseries, even international seed demand, but as well for, the scaling fires that we're seeing on our landscape. We just, that divestment ultimately led us to not be prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. I know there'll be some people who might listen to this and think, well, why can't the forest do this on its own? In fact, many of these pine cones are discovered in stashes that squirrels have put them in. And so where's the change? What is climate change doing to our forest that is making this such a vital activity?
Yeah. So up here in Western Washington, we have, this isn't as significant, but it's something we have to be prepared for. We are seeing far less natural regeneration. You go down to California and even planting ideal seedlings on those landscapes, it's like a moonscape after fire. And so we're not seeing natural regeneration like we have in years past. We are also seeing, as our climate changes, the need for considering moving genetic material with our changing climate. The really cold, really wet falls of my childhood growing up in Western Washington are not as consistent nor as recognizable today. I mean, it was 77 degrees yesterday on October 8th. So it's it's a very different landscape. And so not only having the genetic material to change with that, but making sure that we have enough to be able to address be able to address, our changing climate and the landscapes that they inhabit.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we have, the forest landscape with the changing temperatures and the fact that it's drier, have made them a tinderbox in many respects, with so much deadfall in our forests. And so when that fire moves through, was it due to the regrowth opportunities?
Well, it's been a mix of things. My understanding is that with land management practices of, the early 20th century being, put out all fire's bad, as well as, not having land management that clears, lower brush vegetation. Not only do we have it so that these fires, when they do occur, are far more intense, but they can spread rapidly, but they also leave a, more dense burn scar that's harder for natural regeneration to occur.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been on sites.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was going to add, I've been on sites, reforestation sites, where the site may be 160 acres of reforestation, but the surrounding area, you cannot see all the way to the horizon a living forest. And so when catastrophic fire occurs in those situations, where does the seed come from? Right. And that's what the challenge we're facing right now.
Yeah. We're certainly seeing a rise in forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, but peeking at what is happening in California and the size of those fires, the heat that they're producing, the destructive nature of those fires. That is unless there's seed in banks in order to reforest those, what's the hope of those forests coming back on their own?
Not likely. So,
Mm.
I've definitely brought this up with Trevor before in the past, but humans have been a part of land management since time immemorial, and I think we need to also adjust our scope and recognize that yes, human-induced climate change is what's scaling these fires to be as intense as they are, but human collaboration is what's also going to be part of the critical solution to address it, and we have a responsibility to do that. So, getting back to like seed supply and even our station model, being able to connect with communities and have the people who live in these forests be a part of those solutions, I think will be critical moving forward. A note on our stations too, our stations in Western Washington are unique in that they both supply seed, both for creating a healthy seed bank for Western Washington. So like there's a nice security blanket there. But also they do address some of the most like active markets of this very unique niche seed economy. And so the interesting part there is that in the responsibility of, Silvaseed, we have a responsibility to continue to invest in these communities, pay for collection, adjust our prices to actually meet the economic needs and the value of that seed. But we also use quite frankly, use the funds of those types of collections are then put into the more costly collections that are in the more dire areas such as in California. So it's kind of this big circle of a seed economy, if you will, where we do our due diligence in the economies of working in station with our station hosts, making sure that the seed we get there is of a certain quality, meeting people where they're at and continuing to further that investment. And then, taking the profit of that investment and actually putting it right back into other communities that also need the support.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing that strikes me is a tree isn't just a tree. The difference between a cedar tree or a silver fir or a Doug fir, those are all different regions of the North Cascades. Those are all different subclimates of the North Cascades, and obviously some of those subclimates are changing, but the collection of that must be, silver firs I would imagine are probably a tricky one to find.
There's pockets.
No,
There's
that's an
pockets.
easy one.
Yeah, I would say oak is definitely some silver fir come through.
They love silver
What's
fir. They
what's a
love
difficult
picking
one to
silver
find?
fir up here. Yeah, it's just up. It's still within low enough elevation, right above 2,500, 3,000 feet, where our roads that have not been closed, you can still access. And you can get really big ones since the silver fir cones are so much bigger than the smaller Douglas fir cones. It's a lot easier to find and get and gather. And so they love it when we weren't buying it this year, but past years when we've been buying it, that is what everybody is pretty much going after.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you determine what you're going to be collecting and paying for and what you're not? Is that based off of what you've got in the bank, or?
That's down to Silvaseed. Silvaseed tells us what we're going to be buying that year, and we ask permission if somebody brings in something unique or different.
Yeah. Felicia, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so we pretty much we do a bit of seed planning at the beginning of each year. So that involves looking at our inventories, looking at demand in the marketplace, as well as looking at, previous fire scars, even playing with tools such as the seed lot selection tool. California has a great one called the climate adapted seed tool, and seeing where seed may be moving across the landscape as our climate changes to kind of assess, all right, we, organize collection based on these needs directed to demand. And then with this left, what's left in our budget, let's go towards these sources of seed that are critical. Someone needs to go after them. However, none of that could be applied unless the crop is there. So it's a mix of both. It's a mix of pre-planning as well as going out. We go on the ground and scout for crop. And that's, quite frankly, cruising on timber roads and cruising through communities. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I definitely recommend folks to check out the cone scouting guide that Mast has on our website. Go outside, go look up. And actually, I'm sure right now, if you're listening to this in the fall, you will certainly see brown cones hanging on trees. And so, that's cone once it's already been opened and released its seed. So that's past its due. But if you pay attention next year, you'll see green cones in the future. And those are what we go after.
Okay. All right.
And
So
I
Trevor,
think
you said
that's
about, oh, go ahead.
key.
Sorry.
Felicia said that I love about cone picking is it's a new way to see the forest. Like you're out there and we're training kids on how to see the cones, which they don't realize this whole ecological niche and everything we're talking about here. And you start to learn how to see cones, identify cones, and it's a new way of being empowered to see the woods and the forest for the seeds. And bringing back to like that, Felicia hit on, I just want to reiterate that value of local knowledge. Like my father notices as a logger, longtime logger, just different tree and genetics, not within, between the different zones, but on the different slopes of the same peak and how those genetics are expressed and where they are from the wild ones that are there. And so there's a lot of uniqueness and understanding tied to place and the people that live here that are really valuable.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. This idea of being rooted and tied to place. The more we seem to move away from our rural communities, the less we seem to be. We find importance in being tied to place, and as fifth generation, describe a little bit about what that means to you and how those changes have impacted the way you see the world.
Oh, wow. What it means is fifth generation. There is people, I was in a different meeting when they were talking about stories of our ancestors and where we're from and how a lot of people can tie it back to Europe. I can't tie back stories beyond the Americas to Europe with how long my family's been here. And I don't know what that means. Like my family stories is like, where's that fishing spot? Or how was that timber on this slope or this hunting ground and how it's changed that we've passed down for, generations now. And I care, like a really care and compassion for this landscape. And with that as well is what's happened with changes of weather and climate and loss of our glaciers, that my grandparents, my father, my grandparents, and great grandparents all experienced living in this place. It is a perspective of really care, but also like, how do we adapt? Like times have changed in generations, just economically. Whether that's, my great grandfather being a butcher and butchers are no longer needed. And now, my grandfather and father being loggers and that being a not as profitable job as it once was or able to happen. And so we've had to adapt. But we've really cared for this landscape. My great grandfather and grandmother saved some forests just outside of town so that the future generations could really appreciate the old growth that was there that was being logged down. And so there is an understanding and a care that we are dependent. It's reciprocal. Like we need to care for this place and have these salmon and these fish thrive and these squirrels and these ecosystems, but also that it cares for us. It's a reciprocal relationship and we're tied to it long term. And so there is a lot of fear as we've been disempowered, like we're talking about these rural communities. The Forest Service used to be in our community and the land managers used to be here and we were empowered to have, a coffee or a beer with them and talk about this land, long time relationship with place and what that means economically for our future. And that's been taken away. Like we are very disempowered for our future and having a voice over it. And so I feel in some ways, very worried because of what does that mean for the biodiversity of the future of this landscape when you have national policies and procedures so much more governing us than people who live here. A lot of times Forest Service employees are moving from elsewhere. A lot of the people in the Northwest, I think only 30% of the people from Seattle grew up there. There's not even a knowledge, which is great. Like I love that, but understanding that there is a knowledge of people that have stayed here and tied to place that may be right or wrong, but that can add an understanding for long-term management is really difficult. You see all the nonprofits, when I analyze all the nonprofits of Seattle and government agencies, I don't think there's a single one that's involved in outdoor recreation or in conservation that they grew up in the Northwest, which
Right.
is, there might be one or two, which it just means that voice is missing from the conversation of understanding, let alone that grew up in a rural forest community. And so it's just a real struggle when you're trying to have this voice that's from a different angle, be understood and heard about the effects of the Northwest Forest Plan, or partnering with Indigenous members who are members in my community and how to support them. And every tribe's different, like understanding that that's been a long-term relationship that I care deeply about. It's one of the reasons why this partnership with Mast is so important, is bringing back some opportunities here for this local involvement that is really being skipped over by a lot of agencies and conservation groups.
Yeah. Yeah. Trevor, that is a lot to try and capture on film, and all of that we just discussed is in the film. Talk a little bit about that process, about trying to figure out and work through capturing these stories and these elements.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll first say, I'm not sure if it's all in the film, but it definitely leads you down this path. And that's why I'm so glad Felicia and Oak are joining us today, because folks have a chance to see it. I hope it creates a curiosity for them about this. And this is a great place to learn more. But I lost track of your question. Can you give it to me one more time, please?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, everything that we've just talked about, as far as, what is it? Why do we do it? And what is the impact, not just on these rural communities, but on the individuals that are coming in from the city in order to participate and help, or even just recreate. And so that is all in the film. Maybe it's alluded to, or, but you did visually show it. Talk a little bit about capturing that and what that process is like for you, and taking it from idea to product.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, just to take you kind of inside the experience, I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen, kind of moving through this space, but I knew that Oak was going to be a great place to get started. And so I'd reached out to Oak and said, hey, I'm trying to make a film about a cone collection. Is the buying station still open? And I was like, oh no, it's closed, but we could open for you again. And he says, I got some buyers or some collectors who want to potentially bring in some seed. And so on my way there to meet him, I live on San Juan Island, took the ferry, drove out, and I'm on this long road that connects Darrington and Concrete, and I just kind of pull over for a second to see what I can capture, because it's incredibly smoky at this time. The Bolt Creek fire, I think, as Felicia had said earlier, is happening, which is one of, in my recent memory, one of the nearest larger fires that we've had west of the Cascades.
Yeah.
Speaks to that, unusual nature of fire today. So I'm just sitting on the hood of my car, got my record button pressed, and a logging truck comes down the road, and coming the other way is a Tesla. And I was like, I'm not sure quite what the symbolism means, but there's a there,
It's there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think once I saw that, I was like, oh, okay, there's something here. And I knew that, we could keep moving forward. And as I made my way further in to Darrington, I stopped by the mill, there's a large area there before you get into the main town. And just to see, the smoke all around the mill as the wood is being processed, there's nature's making a point of some kind, there as well. And then to get to actually meet Oak, and then the whole buying station is now shrouded in smoke, and these collectors are coming in and they're selling this seed. The symbolism is just off the charts, for me, and I think for everybody around us, as it relates to this pursuit. So that then led the next day to meeting Marty and Adrian, who are the older couple that hold up the Come People sign. And Oak had introduced me to them, and I'd known through Silva Seed as well that we were working with them. And I mean, I was a little bit worried meeting them, honestly, because I felt like we'd been bothering them, trying to connect with them. And, I was ready for the stink eye when I showed up. And I got the complete opposite. I got just incredible warmth and joy, and to see the relationship that Marty and Adrian had with each other as a couple at that age, it just blew me away. The playfulness, there's a scene that's not in the film where she's an incredible nature photographer and she has all this great work. And I'm trying to kind of set up to talk to Marty, and she's in the background holding this work up, like, hey, check this out. And there's a picture of a wolf howling and a bear, and then of course, meeting Marty, he had so much to say, and he really spoke to that generational significance. He mentioned that Adrian, his wife, her parents had a buying station, and he also talks about when the mill shut down at different times, this was a stopgap for him. And that seemed to be a recurring theme as I met more and more people out here. This is a stopgap for folks. It's not a panacea. It's not the solution for everything, but for them, it's a moment in time when they can get by, and it offers that opportunity. But it also speaks to the fickle nature of cone collection. These cones don't come around every year. You don't get the same cone every year. It's called masting, and Felicia knows a lot more than I do about this. But it really speaks to this idea that, like, these things aren't things we can depend on every year. So I think oak can speak to this too. Like, what do we do in the meantime, right? When we can't depend on these things, or how do we empower people in these communities to have more of a responsibility in forestry beyond just collections when it does come around. And then the last thing I'll say is just there was an acknowledgement that we were going to move towards Silvaseed at some point. And there's a story that takes place where we meet Lisa, who's an apprentice at that time to the seed bank manager of Silvaseed, Trina. And there's this clear generational difference in that Trina has been, she's so modest. I mean, she's probably has 1 million trees or more on her hands, seed that's gone through her fingers over those last 30 years. And herself, she was an apprentice at one point. And there's this storied history at this place, Silvaseed. It's kind of unusual growing up in Western Washington, Olympia, for me, to see a building still standing from the 1800s, a machine running that is still running well, that tells you to send a telegram if you need customer service. But what I really did see, though, is that there's this generational handoff now where a lot of the people who stood up and helped support forests, that's changed, and now there's a new role. And for some of these folks, they know it and they don't know it, but now they are these keepers of the forest genetic legacy. And that what we mean by genetic, right, is we mean native seed. We mean seed that comes from a very specific region where it can thrive in that place. And if you bring other seed to it, it may not. And to what Felicia said earlier about climate, is it migration, Felicia? Is that right?
Yeah.
What's the right word?
Migration. There's still a lot
Migration.
to be done there, but it means we need to have the genetic material to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that learning, that's a great way to end it. I've just been learning a ton, and it's been an incredible journey. And so I'm really excited to be here to be able to share this story, but also to get these conversations going that we're having right now. So yeah.
It seems to me that there, that as we're talking about this genetic legacy of trees, there's a legacy of obviously that we're trying to figure out collectively of humanity too. How do we care for this, and that legacy doesn't just rest on the shoulders of those who live in these rural communities. Oak, you've the Glacier Peak Institute has done quite a bit to try and bring youth into these forests and participate in that. Can you talk a little bit about transmitting that responsibility and that accountability to the individuals you're bringing in?
Yeah, our futures are really tied to our youth and learning in these processes and systems. And as we've grown as a nation and we have Seattle as this tech hub, we oftentimes think of just being able to pass things down through policies, through online trainings. And this isn't how humans, like, we can transfer certain sets of knowledge, but for millennia, it's been from human to human being passed down, and we are just how we develop mentally, if we look physically, like the needs of a child, we to generate ourselves healthily and have that healthy growth, we need community. We need a social structure that supports us, and parents, and people that love us and care for us, and a way to pass on wisdom. And that is vital. We've developed a system that's grown where it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And the mistakes, I'm going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. And if we're looking at forests, those mistakes, seedlings, you can analyze it on a couple years, but forests, that is generations. And so if we are going to manage these forests for the future, we got to be involving the youth. And like, this is why we made these decisions. How did we do things right? And how did we mess up? And having that humility for the future, and having kids be able to have that responsibility is huge. A big piece that we run into that when you're talking about that undercurrent of today is that we have this idea that we can escape from being a part of an ecosystem.
Well said.
And as a result of that, we oftentimes just focus solutions, environmental solutions, on disempowered rural communities, because those are ones that we can oftentimes have the most voice and power over, that we may not understand those ecosystems. And so I see effects of like Seattle. Seattle's a part of our ecosystem here, with the salmon runs, with the forage fish, with the increasing crow populations that then migrate up here from human sources of food. Like, whether we like it or not, the wild goes from everywhere down in the Puget Sound to the very top of the Cascades and more. And so as a transformational shift that we work on is like, what does it mean to be a part of this ecosystem for our rural communities, for our urban communities, for all our communities here, that we really have to discuss if we want to recover salmon. Just as a basic example, we have to look at the holistic ecosystem and not just one part of it. And so that's what we try to do at GPI, is what does it mean to live as a part of an ecosystem?
Yeah. Yeah. The interconnected paradigm is one that, our culture, it's not what we grew up with. It's, our culture is very much a deconstructionist. If you can take it apart, you can possess it, kind of culture. And it certainly seems like the path forward is not one of power over, but it's one of power with.
Yeah.
Anybody want to continue those ideas?
I think, in terms of power with, something that I often reflect on in this, I consider myself an organizer. I'm not the one collecting. I'm not the one, planting. I'm simply organizing the efforts to make the thing happen with some of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life. Maybe I'll write about it in the future. But in that, you find in organizing, not only do you find commonalities across, people you never thought you'd meet or find level ground with, but you also find how much power there is in that. And then that, as an organizer, gives me more push to advocate for better pay for our collectors, advocate for better systems for our collectors, advocate for, oh, if we do this way, or even learning from my collectors of, oh, I'm gonna, let's take that feedback, let's work on this together. So I think, and this is from from the seed perspective, just the very beginning of reforestation or restoration, quite frankly. There's a lot of these lessons that are learned in sharing that power with the people that are involved and need to be involved in order to make this truly scalable.
Yeah. Felicia, I think you may have just touched on something and it's this shift from reforestation to restoration. Is it an accurate statement to say that in the past 40 years, seed collection has shifted from the concept of reforestation as far as forest management to restoration?
I wouldn't say the last 40 years. I'd say maybe the last 5, but that's also my narrow career scope. Yes. So typically, the seed supply chain that has always been supported, funded, I say funded, we could do a whole other talk about, labor equity, is seed for timber mills, seed for, those private industrial landowners That's been the pretty much guaranteed seed supply, not for, the larches of our high elevation alpine areas, not for mountain hemlock or, specific areas of Douglas fir that, are really unique old growth populations. And then, I could stand on my pedestal and talk all about, the seed sources across the West that like really need to be focused on. But at the end of the day, it's about looking, how do we start to invest in the things that, do not have a dollar sign yet, and even then are going to probably take a bit of pushing to make sure that they are actually valued for what they're worth. The example I'll give is, I organize collections all across the Western US. So from the West Coast all the way to the Rockies. And there are areas that have no seed in state bank, in federal, as far as we know, federal, they don't share their inventories, or, in the private market anywhere. But there are also private landowners who would like to reforest, would like to buy seedlings, but there's not genetic material for them to access. Well, there's no way for us to invest in that collection beforehand. So it's trying to connect some of, as I mentioned before, we work with these stations who are, for the most part, actually addressing where there is economic demand, live and active, but being able to take that to then invest in an equitable collection. And I say equitable meaning contractors are paid fairly. Everyone involved in the labor is paid fairly, like they're paid for their time. They're not just, they're not just taken advantage of, like they can be in a lot of contractor situations. We really try and work and build those relationships also in those types of collections beyond the stations. How do we start that economy that's like the unrealized value potential of seed that is yet to be sown? We're just getting started there, but that I definitely run into that issue quite frequently.
Sure. Yeah. And there's a there's a timeline discrepancy, right? The value that human beings put on it economically, but also the urgency of getting a seed, putting the seed in the ground, getting it to plant, and having it actually come to be a viable tree is a way longer timeline. And so,
Yep.
like there's the urgency to try and communicate to individuals that might be able to fund or push these initiatives forward has got to be fairly high.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is not understood yet. Even in, the most well-intentioned folks that want to be involved in reforestation or restoration at any scale, they may not always come in knowing the biological timelines of these things. So, a cone takes 1 to 2 years, depending on the species, to develop, but that ripeness window is weeks, if not days.
Oh, wow.
You are only able to pick it and have the seed be viable in a very short window. In the Pacific temperate Northwest, it's we've got our pros and cons. We've got it where it's like, we can organize these squirrel cache collections. That is often not the case in a lot of other ecosystems. So there's a great opportunity there. But we also have it, I've had cone collections. I had one this year near Lake Wenatchee, where I was going to have someone go out there, and within 3 days the cones opened and we lost the entire crop. It was
Oh,
a small
wow.
collection, but it would have been great for things like the Pioneer Fire. So, we're working in these really tight windows in many of our ecosystems. The scale of investment that's needed on the front end, quite frankly, doesn't always mean that there's going to be seed output on the back end, but it doesn't mean that we can't get away from needing that front end investment.
Yeah. It's
Can
really
somebody
like a
speak-
nest. I was just
Go
going to
ahead.
say it's really like a nesting doll of time envelopes when it
Yeah.
comes to seed. It's sort of mind-boggling when you look at all of those different constraints and how they weigh up against each other in order to be able to collect seed at the right time.
Yeah. And without the funding, when you need the funding, that nesting falls apart.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Who are we looking for funding? What kind of organizations?
I'd love for our sorry for saying this. I would love for our government to further invest in ecological solutions versus the terrors that we fund overseas. I would prefer us to actually fund in solutions for both our working class communities and the ecosystems that we rely on. The Biden administration, they put out actually specific amount of money. I think it was like $11 million or something like that, just for seed collection, ballpark. And that amount of money wouldn't even cover the seed needs for the state of California. And that was a
Wow.
national funding. So regardless of administration that comes into office, even, the breadcrumbs that get thrown in this direction, we need to be demanding more from both our government officials and the administrations that lead us, as well as, looking to, there's some opportunities on the horizon for different types of capital to be going towards these solutions. But I think there also needs to be focus on, who's organizing to get that finance in the right place, as well as to execute it correctly. The work that we do in making sure that we are, my finance team can attest to this. I'm definitely the person that I'm not going for the lowest quote. I'm going for what is the fair rate for my contractors that makes it so they can make a living and will work with me again. That's the ecosystem we need to be looking at, not for lowest bidder. So I think there needs to be both like a culture change as well as, a number of other factors of getting funding in the door.
Is a private funding corporations, green initiatives, is that an option?
I believe so, but it's whom. I think there are some opportunities coming on the horizon, but it's, the amount of relationship building to get there is going to, again, collaboration. That's what's going to take.
And just building on that, a lot of times, from my understanding, how the system works out with funding, like we need more. Oftentimes, our large forest landowners, which are not the largest at-risk forests for conversion, that's something we want to avoid to sustain ecosystems in rural communities and working forests. But those ones have more resources dedicated. Our small forest landowners don't have as many resources to support them. And so those are the highest at risk for conversion, and also poor land management that occurs if we're looking at the private side and moving these forwards for funding. So there needs to be support for them, initiatives. The DNR in Washington State has some great programs, and our counties have, depending county to county, some great programs to support small forest landowners. But there has to be programs to support, because again, these crops, want to think about as crops, or these relationships with a single tree are lasting decades, if not generations. And so that knowledge of how to manage it is oftentimes lost by a lot of private landowners that aren't big forest landowners. With funding, to hit upon is like our funding systems do not serve disadvantaged communities, especially rural forest ones. Most of that money goes to nonprofits in urban areas that employ people elsewhere, which are great. These are amazing nonprofits or government agencies, but they're not employing these underserved forest communities where the work is occurring. And so that money comes, like there's these endeavors, and they'll sign it and they'll be like, oh, great, we're doing this forestry work. But they're not looking at it at the community forest level. It's so much of our infrastructure, as we have declined, has been lost, that there needs to be more investment in these communities to manage and care for their forests long term. And that's a big struggle. Like we have to, in Darrington and our rural forest communities, to try and get that support as well to grow up, so we have the infrastructure to support this restoration economy and be a piece of it.
Yeah. That goes back and speaks to this idea of the disconnected worldview. And and the fact that so much funding goes towards vision, goal, outcome, rather than the interconnected nature of it. And I think that's one of the things that the film does a wonderful job highlighting is that it's it is about people, and I mean, it's called Cone People, right? And so it's not only about the importance of these seeds and why we're doing it, but it's about the people in the communities who are performing the action.
Yeah. Absolutely. Felicia, I saw you wanted to talk there.
Oh, I was just, to reiterate, seed solutions, reforestation solutions, quite frankly, solutions to climate change in general rely on people. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of the communities that get overlooked are where a lot of the solutions lie, but also they require the investment, respect, and engagement in order for, the potential to be fully unlocked there. So, there, what is it? New York Climate Week happens. There's these big, tech events where people go talk about, our changing climate and yada, yada, and they're talking in kind of a vacuum, but where the work is happening is on the ground. It's in these communities, and it's, there's so much more nuance, and all these communities have, something unique to offer. It's a pleasure to work in, but it's also, something that requires engagement and requires investment.
Yeah, it really does. Let's so people can reach out and connect with you. If you want to share some information about who you are and where people can connect, let's do that. Trever, let's end with you and the film and where it's going to be viewed, and Oak, let's start with you and the Glacier Peak Institute.
Yeah, you can reach us online, Glacier Peak Institute. There's opportunities to volunteer, to learn more about us. We have a whole workforce program as well to develop workers in our community, because again, a lot of these jobs go elsewhere. Follow us on social media, Instagram. We also have fundraisers that are happening. In a couple of weeks, we're having a breakfast, and every spring we have a fundraiser in Seattle. So it's a great opportunity. Just check us out online and follow us, and sign up for our newsletter. If you have an idea of how to support, I'm somebody who humbly started this and I'm learning, go ahead, shoot me an email via our online contacts. It'd be great to hear from you.
And that's glacierpeakinstitute.com. Is that what the
.org, glacierpeakinstitute.org. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn.
You hit it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, and folks can reach me. I invite folks to actually just check me out on LinkedIn. Just Felicia Froton. If you type in seed program manager, I might be the only one that comes up. So, I'd love to, talk about solutions there. So connect with me.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'll take it away. We've got Cone People, which will be showing at the Friday Harbor Film Festival, and that starts on October 25th and shows at 1:15, and then it'll be on Sunday as well at 1:15 as part of a larger block called Land and Sea, which shows a ton of amazing filmmakers who are bringing stories very similar to the Cone People to the festival. And then if you're in Alaska from December 16th to the 15th at the Anchorage International Film Festival, it'll also be there. And then something in the works, we're potentially putting Cone People on the road, and it's going to tour 50 some odd countries here in the next year. So there'll be an opportunity for hopefully lots of people to engage in conversations like this.
It's a great documentary short, and I think it features which is one of the aspects to documentaries that I think is so powerful, featuring something that you don't have an awareness for and becoming aware of, and it's beautifully filmed. So any last thoughts from anybody before we wrap up?
No, just thank you so much for having us and letting us, discuss solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for making this space, Jeremy, and Felicia and Oak. Thank you for joining. And I learned again so much, and keeping close to folks like Felicia and Oak is for me a really inspiring part of this process as a filmmaker and as somebody who's trying to get these stories out there. So if there's people out there who are listening and they know people like Felicia and Oak and they're passionate about what they do, make a story about them, get in there. And we need, one way of creating community is sharing story. And so I encourage folks to do that.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining me today at the Plowline Podcast and our guests today. Bringing this kind of content is important to us. We want to bring the kind of content that is informative, thought-provoking, and certainly something that you may not be aware of, but you are now. If you're interested in following the Plowline Podcast or becoming a contributor, you can go to patreon.com/Plowline Productions. And we are also on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and those are the three that we're on. So you can find us there. We'd love for you to follow us. And thanks so much for listening today. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you so much.